Welcome back. Before we move on to the second module, let's quickly cast our minds back to the first module. What we looked at in the first module is what we might call the micro level of language, the question of word combining. How do I combine one word with the next? In this module, we're going to look at a slightly higher level. We're going to look at the meso level. If you wanted to use a Greek term, that might be the appropriate term, which is the level of the paragraph. So basically, this is about combining sentences into paragraphs, and that's what we're going to start with. We're going to start with a little comparison of a German text with an English text in terms of the way sentences are combined. So what I'd like you to do is look at this text for a while, stop the video, pause the video, look at the two texts and compare them in terms of how sentences start, for instance. How is information ordered, especially at the beginning and at the end of sentences, because these are the most interesting junctures in a text. Now, if you've made a careful comparison of the two texts, you'll have noticed a number of differences. Look at the sentence I've underlined here in the German text, auch innerhalb der katholischen Kirche, for instance, which is right in the middle of the text. Well, innerhalb der katholischen Kirche, at this point in the text, does not refer to anything that's been mentioned before. There is no mention of the Catholic Church in the German text up to this point. If you compare that to the corresponding English sentence, we can see that it starts the other way around. It starts with the movement, and the movement has just been mentioned at the end of the previous sentence, where we have the fascist extremist movement. So apparently there's a closer link here between the current sentence and the previous sentence compared to the German text, where so we might say, this is actually a general principle, we might say that in English we have an order of information that presents old information first, the movement, that is known information we've already met, old information. Whereas in the German text, new information is mentioned first, information that we don't yet know about. So that seems to be a basic difference between the German and the English text. Occasionally, at least, the German text and German texts generally, we might generalize here, present new information at the beginning of sentences, and this is not usually the case in English. We get the same thing with Ordnung und Disziplin and Kritik in the last two sentences, both of which have not been mentioned before. There's another difference you may have noticed, which is apparent, especially in the last bit of the English paragraph, the last four sentences. And again, I've underlined sentence beginnings here. And what we find is that the movement is picked up by very similar sentence beginnings. The movement is picked up by the fascist leader, who's obviously the leader of the movement. This then gets picked up by fascism, which is an abstract noun that stands for the movement, and the fascists is the group of people that form the movement. So basically, we have a consistent string of what's called themes here that start every sentence in basically the same way. In German, this would be felt to be a rather monotonous way of going about it, a rather monotonous style. And we get more variation in German. We get auch innerhalb der katholischen Kirche 1922 die Faschisten, Ordnung und Disziplin, and Kritik. So there's a lot more variation here. If we generalize again a little bit from this particular text, we might say that German texts tend to rely more on the encyclopedic knowledge of their readers. Because if you read a sentence like Ordnung und Disziplin sollten herrschen, you have to have some previous knowledge of what fascism is all about to understand the sentence, which is not the case in English, where the picture is built up systematically on the basis of what is already in the text. You've already heard about fascism, and then the text tells you what's new about fascism. Fascism was opposed not only to communism, but also to parliamentary democracy. So that seems to be a basic difference between English and German texts. So now we've learned three things. I'll summarize that again and then we'll go into more detail. We've learned that English texts have what is often called theme removement, old information before new information, in contrast to German. They often use consistent sequences, consistent strings of these themes in successive sentences, and they tend to rely on intratextual knowledge rather than encyclopedic knowledge. Now, once you've understood this basic difference between German and English, the next question, of course, is how do I achieve this myself? And I'm going to talk about 5 principles that may help in the process. The first principle is accessibility. Accessibility basically means the beginning of your sentence needs to be accessible to your reader, so it needs to be old information. End focus is the opposite principle. The newest information, the most significant bit of information, comes at the end of your sentence. Thematic patterning is about how to bring these 2 principles together to achieve a general pattern in your paragraph, to establish a kind of dominant perspective that readers will be able to follow easily. End weight is about the heaviest elements, the longest, the most complex elements being placed at the end of your sentence. And finally, initial subject is about the fact that English sentences tend to start with a subject rather than anything else. And I'll now explain these principles in slightly more detail. The first principle is accessibility. Accessibility basically means that you should make lexical and syntactic choices to make sure that the beginning of your sentence consists of old information, of accessible information. There are 3 basic ways of doing this, which may seem a bit simplistic at first, but when you actually have to do this yourselves in your texts and in exercises, you'll see that actually this is more difficult than appears at first blush. So, how can we achieve accessibility? Accessible information may be given in the previous context. That's the first case and the simplest case, where we simply substitute a pronoun for a noun phrase, that is, to be precise, in the previous sentence. Small people never give up. They cannot afford to. The second case is where information can be inferred, can be deduced from the previous context, as in household goods are no longer built to last. Video recorders, for instance, break down for good after 4 or 5 years. The example is a bit dated now, but the point is obvious. Video recorders stand pars pro toto, if you like, in pars pro toto relationship with household goods. So household goods are a broader term than video recorders, so this is readily inferable. If these 2 devices, if you like, pronominal substitution or inferences from the previous context are not available, you need what we've called an anchoring device. So this is an example. With the advent of wall-to-wall television, many theatres and cinemas are being forced to close their doors, particularly in Scotland. James McLaughlin and Andrew Clow. Now, if I stopped here, you wouldn't be able to understand who these people are. It would be difficult to relate them to the previous context. So we have to make clear who these people are and in what way they are connected with what precedes. So we need to use, or we may use an apposition such as to the new breed of Glasgow producers, which tells us they've got something to do with television or theatre. And yeah, now we've got a clear link with the previous context. We've got an accessible subject, and that's the idea with accessibility. The opposite principle, of course, is that of end focus. We're now looking at the end of a clause. Let's first look at a few examples. Here we have a number of sentences that all look the same, basically. The meaning appears to be the same. The question then, of course, is why do we have so many different formulations of basically the same meaning? Why are there so many different grammatical patterns? John recently gave me present, recently John gave me present, John gave me present recently, John recently gave a present to me. In your school days, you may have been presented with such sentences basically for the sake of learning about grammatical structures in English, but probably your teacher never told you why we have these different grammatical patterns. Well, the answer is quite simple, because they encode different patterns of information ordering. Now, if we want to know something new, we usually ask a question. So let's ask a question like, what did John recently give you? And what we'll find is that we can only answer John recently gave me present, or perhaps recently John gave me a present, or what John recently gave me was a present. But we can't say, what did John recently give you? I was recently given a present by John. That doesn't work, because in that sentence, the last bit is not the bit we're asking about. It's not the answer to our question. So what we get in end position in a sentence is the new bit of information, in a way, the bit that we're asking about, that we're wondering about. So similarly with when did John give you a present? Here we can only answer 3, John gave me a present recently, or possibly 9, it was just recently that John gave me a present. The other sentences are not possible here. So what do we learn from this? Well, English has end focus, the new bit of information, the bit we want to know about, the most important information comes at the end of the sentence. So based on the previous slide, we can now formulate the principle of end focus. Place new information towards the end of your clause, preferably in final position, because that's the position where we usually present new information in English, as we've just seen. Now, if we combine the two principles, principle of accessibility and principle of end focus, we get different types of textual progression, different types of moving from one bit of information to the next bit. And there are two basic types of progression, which I'll confine myself to here. The first is linear progression. Linear progression means that the ream, the new information in the first sentence, for instance, is picked up as theme, as old information, somewhere towards the beginning, or specifically in the subject slot of the next sentence. So I'll illustrate this with this little sample text now. The most crucial part of any football match is the first 10 minutes. During this period picks up minutes, the players have to get used to the conditions, the atmosphere, and the opposition. The difficulties caused by the conditions is within the subject slot here, and it was mentioned at the end of the previous sentence, so that there's a clear link here. Conditions in particular are often underestimated by even the most experienced of players. That's the simplest way of creating accessibility, pronominal substitution using a pronoun for the noun players. They come trotting onto the pitch thinking that their experience will put them in a position to deal with anything that the weather may bring. But a morning of rain, morning of rain, can make any ground treacherously slippery. Consequently, one slip, refers back to slippery, can be enough to go goal behind in the first few minutes. So the pattern that this paragraph follows is a very simple one. We have a theme A, old information. Or in this case, of course, it's the beginning of the text, so it's also new information, if you like. But B is clearly the most important bit of information in that first sentence. This is picked up by a theme that also contains B during this period, first 10 minutes during this period. And then there's a new rime, C, which is the conditions, the atmosphere, and the opposition. And this is followed by another new rime, D, etc. So the basic pattern is A, B, B, C, C, D, etc. The second type of progression is called continuous progression because it keeps the theme constant. As you can see from this pattern here, the A element is kept constant, but the rhematic element, the element that's an end focus, varies. So let's look at this example here. A definition paragraph describes, explains, or defines an unfamiliar term by relating that which is unknown to that which is already known. It makes use, so that's the definition paragraph again, of the techniques of comparison, contrast, and synthesis, often in combination. More specifically, a definition paragraph, same wording as in the first sentence, may be developed by using comparison sentences that show that an unknown term is the same as or like some known term. Or it, again using it, pronominal substitution for definition paragraph, may be developed by using contrast sentences that show that an unknown term, though similar in some respects, is basically unlike some known term. Or it, same thing as in the previous sentence, may be developed blah, 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 and the last sentence starts with, in any case, a given definition paragraph. So again, that's very similar to the first sentence. Now, this kind of progression is actually quite common in English, especially in definition paragraphs or in other types of paragraphs where you explain something. Or for instance, in biographical recounts where you talk about the life of a particular scientist, for instance, and you would keep the scientist in subject position throughout your text. So this is something that goes slightly against the grain of German authors because in German we tend to vary sentence beginnings, and that's something we're brought up with. Even at primary school, we're told that it's good style to vary sentence beginnings, but in English it's quite the reverse, as we can see here. In some types of paragraph, variation is actually forbidden, if you like. The third principle I want to look at is the principle of thematic patterning, which basically combines the two principles we've just been talking about, the principle of accessibility and the principle of end focus. Depending on the dominant perspective you want to establish in your paragraph, you'll go for either linear progression or continuous progression or a mixture of the two. So the principle of thematic patterning states that when choosing your starting point for the construction of a clause, take into account the best thematic pattern for achieving your rhetorical aim. Now let's try this out on a paragraph which is taken from a brochure published by the Rijksmuseum in Amsterdam, and I would claim that one of the sentences here doesn't really work. It doesn't really connect very well with the rest of the paragraph, so it's the odd one out. Try to identify this offending sentence if you like. Pause the video and we'll come back together in a minute. Welcome back. You've probably identified sentence 4 as the offending sentence. Why is sentence 4 the odd one out? Well, all the other sentences conform to the basic pattern. The building, or the container we might say, the room, contains something. Sentence 4 though is the other way around. Artists are exhibited in a container, in a room. So how can we rectify this? Well, basically we just have to turn the sentence around to put it right again. So start with a room. A separate room is devoted to Italian, Spanish and other artists. By the way, this is not just you might think, well, this is just a grammatical problem. It doesn't really matter which way around we put things. But the original sentence tends to suggest to native speakers of English, and perhaps also to Italian and Spanish native speakers, because the same principles operate in these languages, in Italian and Spanish, it might signal to them that Italian, Spanish and other artists are not really that important. They're not as important as other artists, which is probably not the what the authors of this text wanted to suggest. We now come to the principle of end weight, which complements the principle of end focus. Now, you may remember that end focus is about the most significant bit of information being placed at the end of a clause, and this principle is about the heaviest bit being placed at the end of the clause. So it states that place shorter constituents towards the beginning of the clause and the longest and most complex constituents in final position. Let's take an example where something has gone wrong. A number of strongly interrelated factors governing the distribution of wealth are involved here. First, and what follows is probably an enumeration, a list of these factors. There's one word that clearly gives away the fact that this sentence is the wrong way around. That's the word here, because when you use the word here, it means what I've just been talking about, in the context of what I've just been talking about. That's the word here is used in the same way in German, for instance. And we've got a very long subject and a fairly short verb. So this contradicts the principle of end weight, but it also contradicts the principle of, or rather flouts the principle of accessibility. So how can we solve this problem with end weight? I'm going to look at a number of different solutions here. The first is what's called a what clause, or at least that's what I call it here for simplicity's sake. In grammar, it's usually called a pseudo-cleft clause. So we could say what is involved here is a number of interrelated factors governing the distribution of wealth. What the what clause allows us to do is place the short element at the beginning as a kind of dummy element, what is involved here, and then go on to actually present the new bit of information and the longest sentence constituent. And now the factors are also closer to the list that's going to be given in the rest of the text. What clauses are quite common in academic writing, and there are a few more examples here. They're often used with verbs like follow or matter or distinguish. There are many different ways to formalize the same basic idea. What follows is one approach that seems particularly reasonable. In the age of air forces and armored divisions, small nations are lost. What matters today is a unified Europe against America. Or a third important knowledge sourcing mechanism is monitoring. What distinguishes monitoring from other types of sourcing mechanisms is blah, 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 blah. So the what clause always helps you to single out one particular element of the previous context and say something new about it. Now here's another defective sentence. A pressing need for research evidence for practitioners about how best to help neglected children remains. Again, I think you probably get a sense of this sentence being wrong because there's a very short verb at the end and a very long subject. We could use a what clause again to put this right, saying something like what remains, but there are other solutions. Think about that for a moment. Can you come up with another solution to this problem? Well, in this case, we can use one of the simplest types of clauses there is in English, a there clause. So we can say there remains a pressing need for research evidence, etc. Placing the long element at the end and starting the sentence with a very short element. There clauses are frequent with to be, but also with seem and appear, which are also followed by to be then, of course. They're also frequent with other verbs, though, especially in writing in the humanities. Not so frequent in the social sciences or the natural sciences. So we get things like there exist two important traditions, or there followed a lull, history text probably, so far as Islam was concerned. Now here's another sentence. What investment constitutes the best means to reach an ultimate balance among all investment sectors must be carefully analysed with regard to the situation in each country. Again, this sentence is what's often called top-heavy. It starts with a very long element, and we have a rather weak verb combined with an adverb, carefully analysed. Again, think about how to put this right for a moment. Well, in this case, we could use a discontinuous clause, that is an interrupted clause. Perhaps it would be best to first look at the two sentences that start with a controversy. A controversy over the best way to resolve the coronavirus crisis has erupted is one possibility of forming an English sentence, but what you will normally hear on the news, on the BBC News for instance, is a controversy has erupted over, placing the verb between the subject and the prepositional phrase starting with over that belongs to controversy. In German, this prepositional phrase normally comes and stays right after the subject, so it cannot be moved. In English, though, that's quite common. So interrupting the noun phrase so that we get a discontinuous sentence, and we can or a discontinuous clause, and we can apply the same principle to the sentence we've just looked at, the defective sentence, and by turning the noun analyze into analysis, so it becomes a noun like controversy, And then, of course, any noun can be preceded by an adjective, so the adverb becomes the adjective careful. And then we get the sentence careful analysis. Now what follows is the interruption by the verb phrase, discontinuous clause, remember. Careful analysis must be made of, now comes the prepositional phrase, of the situation in each country as to what investment constitutes the best means to reach an ultimate balance among all investment sectors. So now we have a smoothly flowing English sentence that starts with a short element and ends with a longer one. The fourth option we can use to achieve end weight is to use an id clause. So let's apply this to the sentence from the previous slide. What we get then is, it is necessary, for instance, to carry out a careful analysis of the situation. Again, starting with a short introductory element and ending the clause with a long element. This brings us to the final principle, which is the initial subject principle. Anyone who reads English texts with any regularity will have noticed that they start with the subject far more frequently than sentences in German, for instance. So the initial subject principle is that you should seek idiomatic formulations which allow the subject to appear in clause initial position. Again, let's try to apply this to a defective sentence, an incorrect sentence. From the analysis, the true nature of the problem became apparent. Now, that kind of sentence was still very common in the 19th century, but it's now felt to be slightly uncouth, slightly odd. From the analysis, the true nature of the problem became apparent. It was common, though, in the 19th century because it does obey the principle of accessibility, because analysis is probably what we've been talking about in the previous context. So from the analysis is a logical continuation of the previous context. The problem is that the sentence doesn't start with a subject, which is something that will be required these days. So try to think about how to solve this problem for a moment. Now, one way of solving this problem might be to simply turn the sentence round. At least we might think so at first blush, and we could say something like the true nature of the problem became apparent from the analysis. But of course, we've now flouted the principle of accessibility. The true nature of the problem is new information. The analysis, as we've just seen, is old information. So the order of information was correct in the original sentence. This sentence is the wrong way around. So think again, what might be a possible solution to this problem? Well, what we need, obviously, is analysis as the subject, followed by a verb. That's why I've put 3 dots here. We don't know what the verb is yet. Plus end weight and then focus, new information, and the longest bit at the end. Well, the best verb to use turns out to be reveal. So we can say the analysis reveal the true nature of the problem. Now we've got a perfect English sentence that conforms to all our principles: accessibility, the analysis, short element at the beginning, old information at the beginning, subject at the beginning, reveal, short verb, then the most important bit of information and the newest bit of information at the end. So that's a perfect little English sentence. The analysis revealed the true nature of the problem. Now, this initial subject construction occurs particularly frequently with texts in subject position. So things like this article, this book, this chapter, this section analyzes, argues, claims, demonstrates, etc. where in German we often use the passive voice. In diesem Abschnitt wird X und Y erläutert. In English that should be this section explains blah 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 blah. The same goes for this table, this chart. This figure shows, reveals, suggests, rather than as in German, in this table X and Y can be seen. Another frequent use of the English subject is with places. So rather than saying the construction of Big Ben was completed in London in 1859, which is basically a statement about time and probably not what the author had in mind, you can say something like, in 1859, London witnessed the completion of the construction of Big Ben. So you can use the verb witness with a place. This is also frequent, for instance, with temperatures. London recorded the highest temperature of the day, rather than in London the highest temperature of the day was recorded. And we also get time expressions in subject position. The past few decades, again, we can use the verb witness here, or see. The past few decades have witnessed a definite upsurge in interest in new realism, or recent years have seen a definite upsurge in interest in new realism. Now, even more surprisingly, perhaps, we can also use abstract entities as subjects in English. So in academic articles, you get sentences like, initiatives need to consider the social aspects of obesity. So not people, but rather initiatives. Or a randomized trial, the study, observed a clinically significant trend. So the study observes a trend. That's typical of English academic writing, although frowned upon by some people, but it's perfectly natural and perfectly ordinary. Another important way of using subjects is to introduce causes in subject position. So rather than saying because of this there would be an inflationary gap, imitating German darum or daher or something like that, it is preferable to say this would lead to an inflationary gap. Similarly, with this new agreement, the railways will come to a standstill, which should be rephrased as this new agreement will bring the railways to a standstill. Or due to, which is one of the most overused prepositions in German English, if you like, due to the fight against the coronavirus, there will be job losses. Well, this should be rephrased as the fight against the coronavirus will involve or will entail job losses. What we can see in operation here is a basic principle in academic text that I'll come back to in the next module about academic style. It shows us that academic texts, or academic sentences rather, often follow the pattern cause plus relational verb plus effect. The relational verb often being a causative verb, a verb that expresses cause. Now, before I summarize these 5 principles in slightly different terms again, I'd like to have a look at the revision process, because you may not be able to implement these principles right away. You may not be able to apply them while you're writing at the moment. They will become second nature to you after a while, but that process does take some time. So they will probably, at the moment, they will probably be more useful to you during the revision process when you edit and proofread your text. So there will be a number of warning signs that should alert you to the fact that something has gone wrong. The first of these warning signs is overlong subjects. Here's an example. The literature in general until 1995 has been reviewed in the appropriate chapters of the preceding editions and earlier reviews quoted therein. The comprehensive review by Neuenhofer 1978 and the chapter on 1 to 3 triazymes in the book by Benson 1984, and then there's a bracket putting 1, 2, 3 triazyme chemistry into the wider context of contiguous nitrogen chain compounds. And you run out of breath when you get to the end of the sentence, should be especially mentioned. Now, it's obvious that this subject is too long and can't be memorized by any normally gifted reader, at least. What do we do in such cases? Well, we apply some of our principles. We place the verbal element at the beginning. There shouldn't be any short verbs at the end of your sentences. And we could use a discontinuous structure here. So to achieve end weight, we said one way of doing this is to use a discontinuous structure, turning the verb into noun. Well, what's the verb from, what's the noun from the verb mention? That's mention itself, to make a mention, for instance. In any good collocations dictionary, you'll find the phrase special mention should be made of. So that's the phrase we can use at the beginning of our sentence, and then we simply place the long element at the end of our sentence, and Bob's your uncle. Now, a second problem you need to be able to identify is new information before old information. So basically a violation of the accessibility principle, but also perhaps the principle of end focus, but usually the accessibility principle. To do this, you need to consider sentences as pairs from now on. So don't focus on just the current sentence, the sentence you're currently writing, but also on what precedes, on the sentence, on the preceding sentence. Again, let's take an example. Traditional agriculture is a monocultural system whereby farmers repeatedly grow just a single crop in the same field. Soil exhaustion, now this is new information here because the preceding sentence doesn't mention soil exhaustion, is caused by such systems. That's old information because systems have already been mentioned, monocultural systems. Now the solution is to make the passive verb active and then turn the sentence round, which gives us such systems lead to soil exhaustion. So always consider sentences as pairs from now on, and these kinds of things can be solved quite easily. Now, the third warning sign is prepositions at the beginning of a clause in combination with a passive verb. So this is about a particular sentence shape that is fairly easy to identify. Whenever a sentence starts with a preposition like with, as in the sentence where I've underlined with here, and ends with a passive verb can be solved, this should set alarm bells ringing, because usually this is just an imitation of a typical German sentence pattern where, for instance, a cause, we've just been talking about causes, the causes are not introduced as subjects, but rather as prepositional phrases. So this will be typical of the German approach to things. How can we solve this? Well, quite easily. We cross out the preposition and use the remaining noun or noun phrase as the subject of our sentence. So rather than saying with these arrangements, we say these arrangements. Then we need to make the verb active. Very often you can simply use the same verb in an active construction, and that's even more natural in English. So you can say these arrangements can solve the problem. Where this is not possible, you can use a kind of auxiliary verb like a yoking word, you might say, like make, or make possible, or help, allow, or enable. So I could say something like the verb allow allows you to place causes in subject position, where in German I would say, das Verb mit dem Verb erlauben lassen sich Ursachen in Subjektposition aufführen. So we can see the two countervailing tendencies illustrated by this little sentence. I'll end with a quick summary of the main points. Basically, you should always look at both the beginning and the end of your clause, the initial position and final position. Old information should be placed in subject position, so avoid placing new information in subject position. Don't overload the front of the clause. So one of the big warning signs we've just seen is overlong subjects. These should be avoided at all cost. Consider the value of establishing a dominant perspective. So if you're defining something, then clearly you should use continuous progression, keeping the theme, the subject more or less constant, for instance. If you're describing a process in your methods section, for instance, it would be more appropriate probably to use linear progression. But there can be different mixes, different combinations of these two basic principles of progression. Start your sentence with a subject wherever possible. English has far more possibilities for starting sentences with a subject. And as far as final position is concerned, place new information towards the end of the clause, preferably in final position, and also place the longest and the most complex bits of information in final position. To do this, you've got a number of options. You can use discontinuous structures, you can use their clauses, you can use what clauses, you can use it clauses. Thank you for listening.